The Supreme Court has just delivered a 6-3 decision that has set off a firestorm in Washington and ignited a major constitutional clash with the Department of Justice. This is not a quiet legal disagreement happening behind closed doors. This is an open confrontation between the nation's highest court and one of the most powerful executive agencies in the federal government, and what happens next could reshape gun rights across America for decades to come. The DOJ is not backing down. The justices have drawn a line in the sand, and millions of gun owners are watching to see if their constitutional rights will be defended or trampled in the political battle that's now unfolding. If you care about the Second Amendment, if you care about the balance of power in our government, if you care about what the Constitution actually means in practice and not just in theory, then you need to stay with me until the very end of this video. What I'm about to reveal affects every gun owner in this country, and the stakes have never been higher. Here's what just happened. In a 6-3 ruling that came down with all the force of a constitutional thunderclap, the Supreme Court sided with gun rights advocates and delivered a crushing blow to the Department of Justice's position on federal firearm restrictions. The case centered on a challenge to DOJ policies and enforcement actions that critics argued went far beyond what the Constitution allows, trampling on Second Amendment rights under the guise of administrative authority. Breaking news graphics lit up screens across the nation as legal analysts tried to process the implications of this decision. The marble steps of the Supreme Court building became ground zero for a legal earthquake that has the DOJ scrambling, politicians choosing sides, and gun owners celebrating what many are calling a historic victory. But this story is just beginning, because what the court ruled and how the Department of Justice is responding has created a constitutional clash that could define the future of gun rights in America. To understand the magnitude of this moment, you need to know what led us here. For months, tension had been building as the Department of Justice pushed interpretations of federal gun laws that many constitutional experts said crossed the line. The DOJ had been aggressively enforcing regulations that went beyond what Congress had clearly authorized, using administrative rulemaking to effectively create new restrictions without going through the legislative process. Gun rights groups sounded the alarm, arguing that unelected bureaucrats were rewriting the rules to suit a political agenda hostile to the Second Amendment. Lower courts were divided, with some judges rubber-stamping the DOJ's expansive claims of authority, while others pushed back and questioned whether the agency had gone rogue. Public anticipation grew as the case made its way to the Supreme Court, with everyone knowing that the justices would have to decide not just a narrow technical question, but a fundamental issue about the limits of executive power and the scope of constitutional rights. This has been building for months as the DOJ pushed boundaries that many Americans believe go far beyond what the Constitution permits, and now the Supreme Court has finally weighed in with a decision that changes everything. In a 6-3 vote that sent shockwaves through the federal government, the Supreme Court struck down key DOJ arguments and sided decisively with the position that the agency had overstepped its constitutional authority. The majority opinion, joined by 6 justices, made clear that the Department of Justice cannot use vague statutory language as a blank check to impose whatever gun restrictions it deems appropriate. The court held that when federal agencies interpret laws affecting constitutional rights, they must do so with precision and restraint, not with the kind of expansive bureaucratic creativity that turns suggestions into mandates and guidelines into criminal prohibitions. In language that legal scholars are calling some of the strongest defense of Second Amendment rights in recent memory, the majority explained that the DOJ's interpretation was inconsistent with constitutional precedent, unsupported by the actual text of the statutes it claimed to be enforcing, and fundamentally at odds with the principle that limitations on constitutional rights must come from clear legislative choices, not administrative improvisation. The court emphasized that the Second Amendment is not subject to a different, weaker standard of protection just because some people in government believe gun rights are dangerous or outdated. 6 justices looked at what the DOJ was doing and said no. This goes too far, this violates the Constitution, and this cannot stand. The decision strips away the legal foundation that the Justice Department had been using to justify aggressive enforcement actions, leaving the agency's entire regulatory approach in serious jeopardy. The Department of Justice did not waste a single second before pushing back hard against this Supreme Court decision. Within hours of the ruling being published, DOJ officials were signaling that they would explore every possible avenue to minimize the impact and preserve as much of their enforcement agenda as possible. Sources inside the agency indicate that lawyers are already working on alternative legal theories, exploring whether different statutory provisions might support continued restrictions, and considering how to reframe their regulations to survive judicial scrutiny. The Attorney General released a statement expressing disappointment with the decision and emphasizing the department's commitment to what they call gun safety, making clear that this is not the end of the fight from their perspective. This is a full-blown clash between the judicial and executive branches, with the DOJ essentially telling the Supreme Court that it will find another way to accomplish what the justices just said it cannot do. Some legal observers are calling this an unprecedented level of defiance, with an executive agency openly strategizing about how to work around a Supreme Court ruling rather than accepting it and changing course. The tension is palpable in Washington as everyone watches to see whether the DOJ will respect the constitutional boundaries the court has drawn or whether this clash will escalate into an even more serious confrontation about who really has the final say when it comes to interpreting the Constitution. The tug-of-war is on, and the implications for gun owners and for the rule of law itself could not be more significant. Now let's talk about what this ruling actually means for you, the law-abiding American trying to understand how this legal battle affects your daily life and your constitutional right. Here's the bottom line. This decision potentially invalidates enforcement actions that the DOJ has been taking against gun owners, dealers, and manufacturers based on interpretations that the Supreme Court has now rejected. If you've been told that certain firearms or accessories are suddenly illegal because of a new DOJ rule, this decision calls that entire regulatory framework into question. If you're a gun dealer who's been living in fear of losing your federal license because the DOJ changed its interpretation of what constitutes a violation, this ruling provides crucial protection by forcing the agency to operate within clearer constitutional boundaries. If you're someone who has been watching the federal government expand its reach into areas of gun ownership that used to be left to states and individuals, this decision is a major pushback that says the DOJ cannot simply invent restrictions that Congress never authorized. The practical impact will unfold over the coming weeks and months as lower courts apply this precedent and as gun owners challenge enforcement actions that relied on the now-rejected DOJ position. This is about whether you can trust that the rules won't change overnight based on the preferences of unelected bureaucrats, whether your constitutional rights are secure or subject to administrative whim, and whether the government operates within the limits the Constitution imposes or simply does whatever it wants until a court stops it. The political reaction to this decision has been swift, fierce, and utterly predictable along partisan lines. Pro-Second Amendment lawmakers are calling this a constitutional victory of the highest order, with some already drafting legislation to further restrict the DOJ's ability to regulate firearms and to provide additional statutory protections for gun rights. These politicians are holding up the 6-3 decision as proof that the judicial system still works to protect individual liberties against government overreach. On the other side of the aisle, critics are warning of what they describe as dangerous consequences, claiming that the ruling ties the hands of law enforcement and makes communities less safe. Several governors from states with strict gun control laws have issued statements condemning the decision and pledging to use state-level authority to fill any gaps they perceive in federal enforcement. Gun rights advocacy groups are mobilizing their members for what they see as a critical moment to press their advantage, while gun control organizations are fundraising off the decision and calling for legislative action to counteract what the court has done. This is political warfare, with each side claiming the moral high ground and accusing the other of either wanting to shred the Constitution or wanting to flood the streets with weapons. The fallout is only beginning, and it's clear that this Supreme Court decision will be a defining issue in upcoming elections and legislative battles. Public reaction and media coverage of this decision reveal the deep divisions that continue to define the American conversation about guns and rights. Mainstream media outlets are framing this as a controversial and potentially dangerous ruling, with headlines emphasizing the clash with the DOJ and warning about the implications for public safety. Talking heads are debating whether the Supreme Court has gone too far in limiting the government's ability to respond to what they characterize as a gun violence crisis. But millions of Americans see this story very differently. On social media, gun owners are celebrating what they view as long overdue justice, a moment when the courts finally stood up for constitutional principles against an overreaching executive agency. Videos analyzing the decision are racking up hundreds of thousands of views, with passionate commentary about what it means to have a Supreme Court willing to enforce limits on government power. The disconnect between how elite media institutions are covering this story and how ordinary Americans are reacting to it could not be more stark. Hashtags related to the decision are trending, with users sharing their own stories of how DOJ overreach has affected them or expressing relief that the Constitution still means something. This is a media narrative battle as much as it is a legal and political battle, with each side trying to shape public perception of whether this ruling represents freedom vindicated or safety endangered. To truly appreciate the significance of this moment, we need to place it in the broader historical context of Second Amendment jurisprudence. This decision builds on landmark cases like Heller, which recognized for the first time in modern Supreme Court history that the Second Amendment protects an individual right to keep and bear arms unconnected to militia service. It extends the logic of Bruin, which established that gun regulations must be consistent with the nation's historical tradition of firearms regulation and cannot be justified simply by invoking general interest in public safety. But this new ruling goes further by directly confronting the question of executive agency power and making clear that the DOJ and other federal agencies cannot use administrative rulemaking as a backdoor way to impose gun restrictions that would never survive if proposed as legislation. This is another critical turning point in America's ongoing battle over gun rights, a battle that has been fought in courtrooms, legislatures, and the court of public opinion for generations. Each of these decisions represents a step toward a more robust and enforceable understanding of what the Second Amendment actually means, moving away from the era when gun rights were treated as subordinate to other policy considerations and toward an era when they receive the same level of constitutional protection as freedom of speech or freedom of religion. The historical arc is clear, and this 6-3 decision is a major milestone on the path toward restoring the Second Amendment to its rightful place in American constitutional law. Looking ahead, the implications of this ruling and the DOJ's defiant response are staggering. With the Department of Justice openly pushing back and looking for ways to continue its enforcement agenda despite what the Supreme Court has said, we can expect a wave of new lawsuits, appeals, and political pressure campaigns. Gun rights organizations will be challenging every DOJ action that relies on the rejected legal theories, forcing the agency to defend its authority in court after court. The DOJ, for its part, will be looking for alternative statutory hooks to hang its regulations on, testing the boundaries of what the Supreme Court will tolerate and trying to accomplish through slightly different legal mechanisms what it can no longer do through the methods the justices have now struck down. This is a long game, and the clash we're witnessing now is just the opening move in what could be years of legal trench warfare. But one thing the Supreme Court has made absolutely clear is that the Constitution still stands, that limits on government power are real and enforceable, and that executive agencies cannot simply do whatever they want in the name of policy preferences that they cannot persuade Congress to enact. The next battles are already beginning, and gun owners across America need to stay informed, stay engaged, and stay ready to defend the ground that has been won.
This fight is far from over, but gun owners nationwide have just gained powerful momentum, and the constitutional principles that protect all of our rights have been reinforced by 6 Supreme Court justices willing to stand up to executive overreach. The Department of Justice may be pushing back, politicians may be choosing sides, and the media may be spinning the story to fit their preferred narratives. But the law is clear, and the Constitution is on the side of those who believe that rights mean something real and enforceable. This is your moment to make your voice heard. Subscribe to this channel right now so you never miss an update on the legal developments that could affect your rights. Share this video with every gun owner you know, every American who cares about constitutional limits on government power, and every person who believes that unelected bureaucrats should not have unlimited authority to rewrite the rules. Leave a comment below telling me what you think about this clash between the Supreme Court and the DOJ, and let's build a community of informed citizens who refuse to let their rights be eroded by agencies that think they know better than the Constitution. The next battle is already beginning, with legal challenges being filed, political strategies being formed, and the future of the Second Amendment hanging in the balance. Stay informed, stay engaged, and never stop fighting for your rights, because the price of liberty is eternal vigilance. God bless you. God bless the Second Amendment. And God bless the United States of America.